What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? What's up, everybody on Suris's Twitch stream? I hope everybody's having a fabulous Monday night. We're not going to take up too much time tonight. We're not going to spend like the hour and a half, or I think it was like almost 2 hours last time that we did
Yeah,
it.
and that was only 3 topics last time.
Yeah,
We
it
managed
was.
to spend 2 hours talking about them. This time we're talking about one, I think, right?
Yeah, which it's kind of broken up into different subtopics, I guess. So we're still talking about a multitude of things, but yeah. So we're pretty much just going to be covering one overarching topic. But tonight we're doing this all for the holiday fundraiser that we're all doing together. Suris and I, as well as KC and a whole bunch of other people, are doing this Christmas fundraiser where we're all going to be donating money to local charities and stuff like that to help out underprivileged people and kids, during the Christmas season. So I've got a little banner scrolling across the screen there if you want to go to that link, or I have the link down in my description. I know Sir said that he was going to be spamming it for his Twitch chat. So
Yep. Right
if you
chat,
guys,
you should see it now.
yeah, if y'all can donate, that would be awesome. If not, share it out. That would be awesome too. And I guess let's get on into the discussion tonight, which is whether or not Jesus existed, the subject everybody loves talking about.
And it's not the first time we've had this discussion. We've tread these waters before, at least once.
Oh yeah, and I mean it was a really good discussion too. So I mean tonight's not going to be a shit slinging contest or anything like that. We're just going to have an honest discussion over the matter, and so with it being a discussion, there's not going to be any losers or winners or anything like that. I mean the only way that you lose is by not having the discussion at all. At least that's how I see it.
I can make one point. If one of us like completely breaks decorum, then I'd consider that kind of a loss too, possibly.
Well, okay, yeah. So, I mean, if one of us loses our shit, then yes, that would be a loss for the person that loses their shit. But as far as like winning an argument or something like that, I don't know. I don't consider there to be winners and losers and everything. So we wanted to talk tonight about the idea that Jesus originally started out as a mythical archangel. And in Suris's video that he did back in, I believe it was like June, wasn't it?
It's been a while. I originally wanted to follow up on that video, and
Yeah.
and what it ended up turning into is, okay, well, I want to follow up on history videos, but right now the next history video that I'm working on, I've actually got everything recorded for it, is not another mythicism video, even though it's been almost half a year since the first one. The history video that I'm working on right now is there historical evidence for the Nazis being socialist? Spoiler alert, turns out there's not. But I even say that in the video, just like, yeah, no, spoiler alert, just so you guys know, that doesn't seem to be actually represented in historical data. But anywho, that's the next one that I'm doing. And then the third history video might be another mythicism video, but it also might be about some other historical events as well. I'm still new to doing history videos as opposed to just philosophy videos and like video responses. So I'm not 100% certain what angle I want to go with that yet, but we'll see. We'll get there eventually.
Okay, that sounds really awesome. I can't wait for those particular videos because I really love history stuff. So I'm definitely going to be watching those. So where I wanted to start off tonight was at the very end of your video back in like June, I think it was. You had mentioned that you felt like it was a red herring to state that, well, Jesus could have been, or at least there's evidence of Jesus being an archangel. At least there being references to an archangel, and you made it kind of sound like this was just made up information by mythicists in order to make it seem like.
Okay, so that's not what I mean when I'm saying the red herring thing. So what seems to be the case, at least with some secular scholars where this is concerned, the way that it seems to be that Paul perceived it is that Jesus may have started, even if you grant the archangel thing, that Jesus started out as an archangel, but then manifested into human form when the birth happens, and then is deified upon his death. So the archangel thing, the reason I said it was a red herring specifically, is because when you make the point that Jesus was an archangel, it sounds as if that's a dismissal of Jesus potentially being a human figure in history as well. But it's not necessarily, because there is a stance that includes both the archangel, I mean, hell, the archangel, the deified, and even the human Jesus all in one. It just depends on which place in history you're sitting. So Paul would have viewed Jesus as an archangel before his birth, and then essentially re-deified after his death on the cross, if that makes sense. So when I'm saying it's a red herring, I'm not saying that the point itself is a red herring. I can grant the archangel argument. What I'm saying is to use the archangel argument as a point against historicity seems to be a bit of a red herring, because it sounds like a point of data that could counter it, but it doesn't seem to necessitate a counter. At least that's how it seems to me.
Right. Well, the whole point in connecting the Jesus figure of Paul to a possible archangel in, you know, in Jewish lore and all of that is to combat the idea that people just made this up out of the blue. Like, there was a Jew that had a wild hair up his ass and decided that, oh, archangel named Jesus is a thing. Like, because a lot of people think that, oh, why would they just make this up? But the whole point is that, and you mentioned Philo in your video, and we're going to get to him here in a minute, but you've got both Paul and Philo that are reading scriptures and interpreting scriptures, and are both finding the same or similar archangels in Jewish ideology that fits this Messiah kind of thing, and they even use the same phrases and vocabulary in order to describe this Messiah figure. So, do you still think that is like, because in your video on this particular part, you not only said that it was a red herring, but that it was pretty much just a made up data point to make it seem like mythicism has more information than it can actually produce.
Okay, no, so I actually rewatched my video before going into this, actually about 20 minutes ago, just to make certain that my phrasing was particular. My point in saying that the data point is brought up, the archangel, if we're talking specifically the archangel data point, I mean, heck, you could even bring up the Philo one as well for this, isn't to say that the data point is made up or that it's pulled out of the ass. It's to say that I'm going to make a comparison, and it's going to sound like it's disparaging, but it's not meant to be. So I apologize, but it's the first one that comes to mind. So, you know, when Ken Ham, and I know that that's why this is going to sound disparaging, because we're talking about that dude. I see the look. I'm sorry, GE. But you know how when Ken Ham makes his point about if we had a global flood, what would we expect to see? We would see dead things scattered across the ground. I don't know exactly how he articulates the point, but he says it in practically every debate he has on the topic. Then he goes, well, what do we expect to find? This. I feel like the same type of thing, maybe not in the way that Ken Ham's doing, because when Ken Ham does it, I think he's trying to be like actually capricious in how he's working, because I don't think Ken Ham is an honest actor, whereas I've known you for a couple of years, so I know you are an honest actor. When Ken Ham does that, and when the archangel thing is brought up, I think the same thing is happening, where you say the point, and everything is factually true. Like, the statements themselves on the surface are factually true. Even if a global flood happened, we would expect to see that. But when you break open that first layer and get into the nuance with the archangel thing, it seems to me that merely bringing up the point without cracking into it, saying, well, could there be an archangel Jesus and also a human Jesus? I personally think there could be. If you just look at it on the surface, it looks like a refutation. Well, if there's an archangel Jesus, why would there be a human Jesus? Obviously, this person was viewed as like a pre-deity, but it's not saying it's a made-up point. It's saying that the point could be entirely valid. Hell, even I believe it's Garthical has a peer-reviewed response on this topic that came out either this year or last year, that he thinks that Paul revered Jesus as a historical person, flesh and blood. But you could also make the case that he viewed Jesus as an archangel, like I said earlier, as an archangel who manifested as a real man on earth, then was deified on his death. You and I, as atheists, probably wouldn't regard the other 2 points, the deification and the archangel, as, you know, legitimate. Like, those things wouldn't have happened in history unless you think there's an archangel somewhere that happened in history. I don't think you do. But we could, but I think that the historical part of it seems to stand regardless of those 2 points. And we can grant that Jesus is an archangel in Paul's theology without it being a point against historicity. I don't think it's a point pulled out of the butt. I just think that it's a point that doesn't necessarily refute historicity.
Well, this is another thing I wanted to bring up, because it's not the whole archangel bit isn't about it being a single point of failure for a historical Jesus. It's that whole argument right there is meant as background information to support a minimal mythicist sort of argument, saying that, like, oh well, like I said before, that it's not that Jews just pulled this randomly out of their butt, that Jesus was coming to sacrifice himself or whatnot. Like, just the whole idea of a Messiah for the Jewish faith, and him being pre-existent in the Jewish faith. Like, a lot of times that is an argument against mythicism, but the fact that we have this angelology in Jewish lore and Jewish faith, I feel like it does support the mythicist hypothesis. I would agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that the historical Jesus is debunked, or like there's no possible way that Jesus could be a real person. But to me, it's very much in support of mythicism, even if it's not like strictly against historicity. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. The only problem I have is, and maybe it's just my personal bias in how I debate. I don't know how many of my debates you've seen, and if you have seen any of them outside of the one that we've debated each other on, then I apologize in advance. But one of the debate tactics that I prefer to use, mainly because it works very well in a court of law, is granting the premise. And it may be just because of my personal bias of. Are you familiar with the concept?
No.
Okay. I'll just do a very quick run through. So let's say you're arguing with an interlocutor, and they bring up a point that it could be any point or any number of points in favor of their position, and you're fairly well convinced that even with that point, their argument could still be taken on. Like, you could just give them the point, even if you think that the point is wrong. You could still give it to them. Like, I don't think Jesus was an archangel because archangels don't exist in my world. But an example of this, did you watch Christopher Hitchens' debate with William Lane Craig?
I probably have, but it's been a while.
Okay. Hitchens used this tactic in the debate with William Lane Craig, where Craig presented the Kalam cosmological argument, as he always does. It's like the one thing he lives and dies on. And then Apologia makes fun of him for it. But so Craig presents the Kalam cosmological argument, and instead of trying to refute any of the premises for the Kalam, Hitchens responds with, "All right, I'll grant you all of that. Congratulations, you've made me a deist. Now you've got 1,000,000 miles to go before I'm a Christian still. Like, you've really done nothing here." And that's what the granting the premise thing does, is it says, okay, cool, I can accept that entire argument, but in accepting it, does it get me to that position? So, like the Archangel thing, I know that you're not trying to argue that it's a knockdown thing for mythicism. I'm just saying that I can grant it, and because I can grant it and it still works well within a historical framework, a historicist framework, not historical. Again, archangels aren't historical. Because I can grant it as being valid in a historicist viewing of the literature, it seems to me that it's not a point in favor of mythicism, but it's also not a point in favor of historicity. It seems to be a point that just lives and breathes in its own amorphous area, and it can be warped into either position. Like, you can use it as a point in like a cumulative case against historicity, but I could also use it in a point to tie some more of the theological aspects of the religion to historicity. It seems that one point on its surface doesn't do much for either case.
Well, okay, so now I'm curious, what, how exactly does a pre-existent archangel figure that both Philo and Paul describe in this exact same way help a historical argument?
Okay, so I think if we're gonna bring Philo into this, then we have the conversation about Philo that we might need to have real quick.
Okay.
I say real quick. I recognize that with this debate, real quick doesn't exist. um, but, um, but we're gonna have fun with it anyway. So when you're talking about Philo talking about Archangel, are you referring to his writings on the branch as they correspond to the logos? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, I mean, yeah, it would be the section. Well, the one of the sections is where he does quote, or he at least ties it to Zechariah 6:11 through 13. And
Hmm.
if you look in the Septuagint version of that, it actually does say Jesus, son of Josedek, describing him as the high priest and everything like that. But there's not only that section, but there's also another section that
Okay,
where he
so
describes the same archangel.
you know that Jesus, son of Jezedek or Jehozadak, that does not mean Jesus, son of Yahweh, right?
Yeah, did I say Yahweh?
Well, no, I'm saying that we agree that Jesus, or Yeshua, or just Joshua, we'll just call him Joshi. Uh, we agree that it was a kind of a common name in Judea for a while. Like, I
Well,
believe in the first century we had like 1 in 26 ish representation for that name.
yeah. I mean, I can agree that it was a common name.
Okay, um, so at that point, having a so okay, hold on, let me get my thoughts together real quick. I'm very scatterbrained 9 times out of 10. Um, so if the argument's going to be based off of Yeshua's father in the book of Zechariah, Jehozadak, Jehozadak just means Yahweh is righteous. Jeho, another pronunciation of Yahweh, and then Zedek is like the righteous one. It's not a very like Yeshua. It's not a really uncommon name in Jewish literature. Um, as a result, it's kind of weird to say that Jesus is also the same Jesus that we would view as like the Messiah. On top of that, when you're looking at the way that the story in Zechariah goes, it says that, if memory serves, um, sorry, I'm spacing on it real quick. So Joshua is shown to be Joshua's the high priest during that, if memory serves, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing to note, I don't think Philo specifically calls any of his angelic beings specifically Joshua, does he? Or Jesus or Yeshua?
Well, no, I mean he doesn't say specifically Jesus, but I mean he does quote Zechariah 6:12, which is the verse that calls him Jesus.
Okay, Zechariah 6:12. I think I had this up
Well, I mean
earlier.
you gotta use the one that Philo would have been using, which would be the Septuagint version.
Okay, let's see here. Do 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 little.
Well, okay,
Septuagint.
so yeah, so it's actually six. Sorry, it's 6:11 where he says Jesus, son of Josedek, the high priest, And thou shalt say to him, Thus saith the Lord Almighty, Behold, the man whose name is the branch, and he shall spring up from his stem and build the house of the Lord.
Okay. If we're looking at the Septuagint translation, believe that in the day of place shall we open the house of David and come to fast the days of the Lord's. Okay, that's not the one I'm thinking of. So at the end of that part of Zechariah, though, isn't there a clear distinction between the king and the king and the priest, showing that the branch is not Zechariah, or not Zechariah? That the branch is not Jesus.
Let's see. I'm Zechariah 6. Let's see. 15, the last verse says, And that they are far from them shall come and build in the house of the Lord, and ye shall know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you, and this shall come to pass if ye diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord your God. Let's see, 14 before that says, And the crown shall be to them that wait patiently, and to the useful men of the captivity, and to them have known it, and the favor of the son of Sophonius, and for a psalm in the house of the Lord. I don't know. I don't really see any kind of distinction here, at least in Zechariah 6. Like, I don't know. Maybe there's a part there that I'm missing that is separating it out.
So he shall receive the power. So in verse 13 it says, He shall receive the power and shall sit and rule upon his throne, and there shall be a priest on his right hand, and a peaceable counsel shall be made between them both. The branch shall shrink from the throne. Okay, so the branch seems to be referring to the king, because the branch is the person who's going to build the house of the Lord. And then afterwards, it says that sitting next to him will be a priest. If Joshua's been noted as the priest beforehand, then that seems to make a distinction between Joshua and the branch.
Okay.
And I believe when Philo does a lot of his writings on the branch, he generally seems to just essentially control F. And I believe it was Anatole was the word for the branch. He ends up pulling branch from Deuteronomy and Genesis and Deuteronomy, and ends up just kind of taking the branch completely divorced of context in each of those areas. So to try to argue that the branch here is Jesus or Joshua seems to be trying to like read Philo into Zechariah, and that doesn't seem to work out very well.
Okay, well, that's not what I'm doing. I'm
Okay.
not trying to read Philo into Zechariah. I mean, literally, I'm focused on Philo and his understanding of things. So, like when I read Philo and he points to Zechariah 6:12, where he's connecting in his writing this archangel figure, because okay, so I've got On the Confusion of Tongues 15, book 15, 62 to 63, and do you mind if I read what it says there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so it's 62. It says, I have also heard of one of the companions of Moses having uttered such a speech as this: Behold, a man whose name is the East, and then the reference to Zechariah 6:12. A very novel appellation indeed, if you consider it as spoken of a man who is compounded of body and soul, but if you look upon it as applied to that incorporeal being who in no respect differs from the divine image, you will then agree that the name of the East has been given to him with great felicity. For the Father of the universe has caused him to spring up as the eldest son, whom, in another passage, he calls the firstborn. And he who is thus born, imitating the ways of his father, has formed such and such species, looking to his archetypal patterns. So, my focus my focus is on Philo and what he's describing here. I mean, he's
Mhm.
referencing like Old Testament scriptures, but then again, that's just, for me at least, that's just proof that you have Jews in the first century, which is when Philo would have been writing, that were looking to the Old Testament scriptures for prophecies or for information about different things like archangels that are called the eldest son, who's also called the firstborn, who is also an agent of creation. Also, he's the divine image of God as well, which is the same way that Jesus is described by Paul.
Even though they're described the same way, um, it seems to be that is there when Philo is arguing, not arguing, but when Philo is referencing Moses and he's saying that Moses said things about the branch, is he implying that Moses already knew of a son of God that would have been named Jesus? Or is he just kind of divorcing that from the context, trying to relate that back to other areas where he can use the branch?
Well, I mean, I don't know, but uh, because I don't know what Moses was considering at that point. He doesn't
Hmm.
say that Moses says Jesus or anything like that. And my argument here isn't that Philo was calling this Messiah figure, Jesus necessarily. Although I think that there is a strong link there with him, referencing that Zechariah 6:12. I don't think that my argument is it necessarily needs the whole his name is Jesus type thing in order
Hmm.
to pan out, because I mean, regardless if you want to consider this archangel figure that Philo is describing and the figure that Paul is describing as like separate angels or whatnot in the Jewish ideology, you have to understand that Philo is referencing this particular angel in the exact same way that Paul is referencing a similar, if not the same, angel. So the whole point of this is that you have two diaspora Jews that are looking to Hellenize their Jewish theology, and they're coming up with the same archangel figure, which would be Jesus. Well, Jesus,
Okay.
sorry, which would be Jesus to Paul, while he may or may not be Jesus to Philo. I'm speaking from the reference point of like Paul and how he talks about the Messiah figure of his faith.
So when Philo's talking about the branch, he's you in his works, he's usually comparing that to his logos, correct? Because if memory serves, Philo was Jewish Greek, so he was doing a lot of like marrying Greek thought with Jewish theology, correct?
Well, yeah, but I mean that's what Paul was doing as well.
Well, because Paul was a Roman communicating to the Greeks. Whereas Philo was Greek and trying to bring that in, Paul was doing the opposite, trying to bring the Jewish into the Greek culture, um, or Roman culture.
What kind of effect does that particular point have on the Hellenization of Jewish beliefs?
So what Paul seems to be doing when he's referring to Jesus is he's referring to Jesus as an individual character for the most part. But when Philo is referring to Jesus or the branch, however you want to use the terminology, it seems that he's referring to it uh, as it regards to like the logos, which would mean that whereas Plato, or not Plato, whereas Philo is arguing that this is something more like like a Platonic form for the logos. Paul is arguing that this is an individual. So these two things, while they seem on the surface that they're referring to the same thing, they don't seem like they ultimately end up doing the same thing together. Because when Philo talks about the branch, in most cases, he's trying to relate that to his idea of the logos, whereas Paul doesn't necessarily do that. I don't think they're trying to do the same thing.
See, I disagree. I think that they are.
Mhm.
Okay, so there's another section on the confusion of tongues, 15:146 through 147, where he says, "And even if there be not as yet anyone who is worthy to be called a son of God, nevertheless let him labor earnestly to be adorned according to his firstborn word, the eldest of his angels, as the great archangel of many names. For he is called the authority and the name of God and the word, and man according to God's image, and he who sees Israel. For which reason I was induced a little while ago to praise the principles of those who said, we are all one man's sons. For even if we are not yet suitable to be called the sons of God, still we may deserve to be called the children of his eternal image, of his most sacred word, for the image of God is his most ancient word." So, I mean, can you refresh my memory? What is Jesus called in the New Testament?
In the New Testament, like, are we talking about specific terminology?
Well, I mean, we're talking about how Jesus is referenced to, I guess, in Paul and then subsequently the Gospels.
I'm drawing a blank, so I'm actually looking it up real quick. Names of Jesus in the New Testament seems to be a few.
Mm.
Jesu forms. So titles that are given seem to be Christ, Lord, Master, the Word, Son of God, Son of Man, Son of David, Lamb of God. Um, I've never heard this one before. New Adam, Second Adam, Last Adam. That
Yes.
one's new to me. That
Well,
one's actually new to me.
Philo has a doctrine of two Adams, and
Mm,
the idea is that Jesus is his firstborn son, or the first
mm.
Adam, and then you have the second Adam, which would be the Adam that we know of from the Old Testament.
Okay, that's like when Christians try to say that, or when Jesus says that he was there at the beginning of creation at the right hand of the Lord.
Hmm.
That fits in with that. Okay.
Well, yeah, and also in the Gospel of John, which I know is, which I don't know if you disagree with me on this, but is more than likely a second century document. But the Gospel of
Mm.
John starts out by calling Jesus the Logos and the Word, and talking about how the Word was made flesh. Did you know? And I know this because I actually asked Braxton Hunter. But there's
Mm.
an entire study in New Testament studies for appearances of Jesus in the Old Testament.
Mm. Well, I know that there is that, because as far as Christian literature is concerned, as they try to argue that Jesus is referenced multiple times in the Old Testament, even though from what I've been able to tell, it seems that it's mostly vague. Anytime that
Well,
Jesus is referenced in the Old Testament, it's incredibly vague.
well, I mean, it's not. It's not so vague. At least, in my opinion, it's not so vague because
Mm.
basically, at any point in time in the Old Testament where you have an angel of the Lord coming to directly interact, with humans or anybody like that. Like a good example of this is when Gideon is selected by an angel of the Lord to be a judge. An
Mm.
angel of the Lord comes and basically speaks to Gideon and tells him that he's gonna be a judge and all this other stuff. So that's a good example of the Jewish ideology of the Word of God coming to interact with humans, and that's exactly the kind of ideology that we find in the New Testament. Is that when Jesus is sent down to earth, um, he is the literal, like the human embodiment of God. He is the Word of God, and by definition, he also is God, which factors into that whole being the divine image of God
Mm.
thing. So, um, I
Is
mean,
that
there.
trying to is that basically trying to argue that when the angel comes down to appoint Gideon, that the angel is Jesus, or that it is just an angel of the Lord?
Well, the argument there, at least from the New Testament scholarly kind of position, is that anytime an angel is referenced like as being the word of God and being an angel of the Lord, that would be a reference to Jesus. Like, or well, okay, so not I'm.
I don't know if that one. I don't know if I agree with that necessarily, because there, for one, if it's specifically saying an angel came down, it seems to be an interpretation, or a type of interpretation, to try to pull Jesus out of that, or at least the like, if we were to accept the archangel Jesus turning into a human Jesus and then a deified Jesus afterwards, to argue that the angel, like the angel that appointed Gideon, is a reference to Jesus, that feels like a stretch to me.
Well, I mean,
That
it's
feels like a
not.
big stretch.
Well, it's not so much a stretch. Now, of course, I did say Jesus, but what I really meant was the Messiah, like of the Jewish faith, or the angel that would eventually become the Messiah of Jewish faith, because that's if you look at how Jesus is described in the New Testament, being the Word of God and God's messenger on earth, he's the embodiment of God here on earth, then. If you'll remember in the Old Testament, like God can only interact with certain people, and even then, like if he shows
Well,
his
as
left,
long as they kill it, as long as they kill a certain number of birds and throw them up on a hill at a certain time on Sunday, then
well,
and
no,
then I guess like fart on one of their beaks.
well, I mean, God specifically only speaks to like major prophets because like he spoke to Moses, like Moses went up on the mountain for like 40 days or something like that, and God spoke with him then, but um, like there are several times where an angel of the Lord, known as the Word of God, who is also referenced as the Lord himself, is giving instructions to prophets as well. And I'm not saying that every single reference in the Old Testament is every single reference of the Word of God is a reference to the Messiah figure or this Messiah archangel, but
Mm.
whenever you have like an angelic being that is sent by God to be his word, that is the same Messiah angel that later on comes in the New Testament to die in ritualistic fashion in order to mirror or parallel Isaac and Abraham and that whole stunt on the mountain. Um, so I mean, there. I'm not expecting you to buy me hook, line, and sinker with this. There's actually a specific word for this kind of study, but I'm just saying,
Christophany, I believe,
yeah,
is
that
the
I
yeah
cannot pronounce
the
the word at all.
or Christophany. That's the word. The so one of the first people, I'm somewhat aware of this. One of the first people who tried to do this type of reading was Justin Martyr. He identified the angel of the Lord as a pre-incarnate Christ, specifically. I can pull up a source for that if you want for reading later. I know that you might find that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, there's a paper written on it. I have it pulled up now, by Susan Garrett in 2008, called "No Ordinary Angels: Celestial Spirits and Christian Claims About Jesus." That is a decently long paper. I can go ahead and send that to you real quick so you can read it later. And I'm not doing that to like as a point in favor or against, just an interesting thing in that field of study. But even with that field of study, it does seem like while there are a lot of instances of people trying to claim that an angel of the Lord in Genesis, Numbers, Judges, etc., are instances of an angel of God or a pre-Christ. Again, even if I were to grant that, I can grant the angel of God thing. I think it still ends up working in the same as the argument um, with Paul having an archangel Jesus, having a pre-Christ or a Christo angel of God in the Old Testament, at least within the theology, doesn't seem to predicate that there would not also be a human Jesus that would be historically referenced afterwards.
I mean, I don't think the existence of a pre-existent archangel in Jewish theology is a like strike against historicity because, I mean, obviously they can have this idea and then be looking for a guy and then just
like obviously there's Christians who hold to this and also hold to a historical Jesus.
Well, right. I mean, I totally agree that's possible, but where I guess where I'm still kind of coming up blank is how you think that like the pre-existent archangel idea actually is in favor of historicity.
So I did say this earlier. Sorry, eating peanuts. Okay, peanuts are the argument against molars. They get stuck in the molars. That's bad. Sorry. Evolution is definitely true, and God did not make perfect bodies. So, I did say it very explicitly earlier. My point on the archangel thing is that I don't view it as a point in favor of historicity, but I also simultaneously do not view it as a wow, that's shaking my camera. That's weird. I also simultaneously do not view it as a point in favor of mythicism. I view it as a point that stands on its own outside of either of them. Because if you have, like for instance, if I take the mythicist position for a moment and have a cumulative amount of data to create a mythological Jesus who we will build a narrative on. Hopefully this is not a straw man of the mythicist position. I'm going to take all of these data points to create a mythological figure to base a religion on. The Archangel Jesus works for that perfectly fine because it's a bunch of points of data being used to create a mythological figure. But if I were to take the historicist position, which I kind of am, I'm here, then at that point, having Paul seeing an archangel or viewing Jesus as an archangel that manifests as a human being functions perfectly well within the theology there. And there's Christian scholars who, through wow, now I can't pronounce it, Christophany, because there are scholars through Christophany who have also made this connection. It seems to me that there's people who argue both for the historic position and for the mythicist position that a pre-existing Jesus who acted as an angel or an archangel, angel of the Lord, it seems to function for both arguments perfectly fine. So I don't see this as a point in favor of my argument, but I also don't see it as a point in favor of the mythicist position either. That's my point. I'm not trying to argue that because there's an archangel, that's evidence of a historical Jesus. I'm just saying that we could accept the theology of there being an archangel there, but it doesn't get us anywhere in either direction. It doesn't push or pull us one way or the other. At least that's how I feel it.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess I would disagree because I feel that a pre-existent archangel figure that Jews, both ones that stayed Jews and ones that eventually turned into Christians, both read the Old Testament stuff and had a Jewish theology of this Messiah figure. Which I guess that would be a good next question is that do you think that Philo was describing like a Messiah figure that was later attributed as Jesus, or like what do you think? Do you think that he was just talking about something completely different?
You mean when Philo's referring to the branch specifically?
Well, when Philo specifically refers to the angel that he calls the firstborn son of God, the image God, agent of creation, and being a pre-existent being.
Mm-hmm. It would seem, if I'm thinking about this correctly, it would seem that he's not really describing a Messiah. He doesn't really use the term Christ or Messiah when he's referring to Logos. He seems to be specifically referring to his instances when he's talking about Moses or when he's reading into other literature. He doesn't seem to use any of the terminology specifically that would link it to the Jewish concept of a Messiah at the time.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I disagree because he uses very specific phrases in order to reference to Jesus's who Jesus is and his purpose. and what Jesus basically does. Because I mean, what you have is like in Romans 8:29. I mean, Paul's calling Jesus the firstborn Son of God. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, he calls him the image of God. And in 1 Corinthians 10:1-4, he calls him the agent of creation. And the fact that Jesus is a pre-existent being exists both in Paul and in the very last gospel that was written, being John. He starts out talking about a pre-existent Jesus. So it kind of seems to me like it would be a stretch to say that Philo and Paul were referencing completely different concepts when you have so many points of intersection with their theology surrounding, this angel of the Lord.
So all of the points that you brought up that, or all of the descriptors that you brought up that Philo uses are not descriptors of a Messiah, because in Jewish theology, a Messiah was a savior, not necessarily strictly the one and all deity, but the Messiah was a savior. All of the things that you described were descriptors of a god or an image of God, but none of them. What are you doing in my office? My cat is just looking at the door, trying to cry to get out. No, the door stays closed. Deal with it. You apparently wanted to be in here. Deal with that.
Yeah, but now the cat's having regrets because it's like, Jesus, how much longer is this gonna go on? Fuck.
They're talking about the Bible. I can't even read. Why are you guys making me? I have a prop Gideon Bible that I keep at all times on my desk for stuff like this. My cat's just looking at it like, I can't even read this thing. Fuck. Okay, good. That landed on the ground. I was hoping that wouldn't land on my desk and knock something over. Anyway, no, my point is that all of those descriptors are for a deity, but they do not seem to describe the same thing that Jewish mythology would consider a Messiah. So,
well, in Paul's theology, isn't Jesus considered a deity?
In Paul's mythology, Jesus is considered a deity. He views him as the Son of God. But I'm talking about in Philo's. Like we do agree that there's intersection between Paul and Philo, but I don't necessarily think that just because there's intersection there, we can look at them almost as if they're the same person, trying to or two people comparing notes with one another. I think they are. You kind of still have to view them as separate. So the fact that Paul deifies Jesus specifically, but Philo is referring to something that's not the Messiah over here, because Paul is referring to Jesus as a Messiah, doesn't necessarily mean that we have to apply that to Philo.
Well, no. So maybe it was just a trick in my wording. I didn't necessarily mean that Philo. I didn't necessarily mean to paint Philo as explicitly describing a Messiah. I know that I use that word. I find myself speaking from the perspective of like Paul in his theology, because in Paul's theology, it's the Messiah that comes to redeem humankind and all that other stuff. Whereas in Philo, I mean, he's describing, at least for me, the exact same character, attributing to him all of the same attributes that Paul would describe Jesus as in his role as the Messiah for the Jewish people. So it kind of seems to me like with a lot of Jewish sects at the time, they had differing opinions on who this particular archangel person was. And for Paul, that was the Messiah, and who would die and resurrect again. Die and resurrect, and
resurrect again. Did we just have the Romans like stab him in the throat once and go, okay, he's back again, guys, do it again. Jesus is now Castlevania's Dracula, everybody. Every time we kill him, the Belmonts have to do it again.
Well, incidentally, if there was an actual empty tomb, my guess is that the Romans would definitely hunt his ass down and kill him a second time. just to make sure that he was really dead. Um, but
Double
my
tap to the
whole
first century.
my whole point here is that the differences between Paul and Philo don't mean that they were describing separate concepts. I feel like the
Mhm.
differences are just an effect of such a diverse landscape of Jewish theology at the time. Because, I mean, you had several different groups at the time that had wildly different ideas about their own faith. And so
Well,
to
yeah,
say that,
Philo and Paul were both really important in the formative years of Christianity
right.
because we had multiple different sects that were trying to figure out what the fuck do we do? We accidentally made a religion, guys. What are we supposed to do with this thing? I have no idea. The Romans are trying to kill us. This is weird.
Um, let's see, we're coming up on an hour, and I was going to try to keep
Mhm.
it right around an hour, which I mean, we could probably go on for a couple hours just on this one topic, but
Just like we did last time.
yeah.
Like I have no problem returning to these topics because it seems like both of us managed every now and again to throw stuff at the other that made us go, okay, hold on. I have to do that thinking thing for a moment. But just in general, the conversation's fun.
Oh yes.
We
No,
need to
I'm
actually play
total.
video games with each other at some point.
Yeah. um, but so another quick question that I had, and I'll ask the question, and then you can explain it, and I really won't, I guess, probe much deeper. But you say that Philo is the language that he uses here is completely different than the language that Paul uses. In the same vein of, like, what we call a biscuit here is different than what we call a biscuit in England or the
Mhm.
UK or whatnot. Um, I mean, do you still think that, like, when Philo says that he's the son of God, like this angel that he's describing is the son of God, even the firstborn son of God, the image of God, agent of creation, and the Word, and all this other stuff? Do you think that he's really using those particular titles and phrases and descriptions in the same way that you described it before?
So it seems to me that while he's using a lot of the same descriptors, um, it's not perfectly analogous to the cookie and biscuit thing. But whereas when Paul uses those descriptors, he's referring to, like, let's call Paul's subject the cookie, and we'll call Philo's subject the biscuit real quick. Even though I can agree it's not perfectly analogous, um, but if we look at how Paul describes these things, Paul is very obviously talking about what he considers to be the Messiah. Whereas I do maintain the position that Philo does not seem like he's arguing for a Messiah. So it seems like they're using a lot of the same terminology, in that if we were talking about a cookie and a biscuit, Paul is arguing for a carbohydrate based item that has sugar baked in, is very flaky, and he bakes it in an oven. And then Philo is talking about a carbohydrate based thing that is flaky, has sugar baked in, and is baked in the oven. But the thing that they end up both getting to is one person gets a cookie out of it due
Right.
to a number of ingredients or not, and then the other person gets a biscuit. I think that that's kind of the situation we have here, where they're using a lot of the same terminology, but one's referring to just a deity, while the other's referring to a deity and also a Messiah. I
Yeah.
think that's
Well,
that's as best as I could articulate it.
right, but I mean, it. I guess it still doesn't make sense to me, because the way that Philo is describing this angel figure is the same way that Paul seems to. Because, like, um, for instance, the line right here in on confusion of tongues, it's 147.
Hmm.
Philo says, "For even if we are not yet suitable to be called the sons of God, still we may deserve to be called the children of His eternal image." I mean, that sounds exactly like Paul's theology on every baptized Christian being a brethren of the Lord, or a brother or sister of the Lord, being in
There
God's family.
they're basically both referring to being part of a deified family at that point, and I can agree with that. But whereas Philo seems to view the angel of the Lord as, again, as kind of his logos, as something generated from God's mind first. This would be within Christian theology, this would be the Jesus that was there on the right hand of creation. At least that's how Jesus said. I think that's how Jesus said it, if memory serves. Paul's terms seem to add on the Messiah bit as well. He's a little more literal and a little less allegorical. So Jesus, like, literally being the Son of God is something that Paul advocates for. I mean, to the point where even when he's getting tortured and sent in jail, he's still holding to that pretty handedly. Whereas that doesn't seem to be the same exact thing. Like, they're arguing up to the same point, like 98% of the way there. But whereas Philo says, and all of this is about a deity, Paul is going, all of this is about a deity who's also the Messiah. That seems to be their point of divergence. Philo's viewing God as logos, the word, and Paul is viewing God as the Messiah, who also happens to be the Word, the Son of Man, etc., everything else there. Like, they're using a lot of the same language when they're referring to Christians as people who are either the sons of God or the brothers and sisters of God, depending on if you're talking to Philo and talking to Paul. They're using a lot of the same language, and they're almost getting to the same destination, but it seems like there's something getting in the way. Now, we could argue that the thing getting in the way is a random angel thing popping down and blinding Saul of Tarsus, and now he's at a different destination. That was a really bad joke. I shouldn't have made that one. But it does seem that, like, they're using a lot of the same language, and they're getting almost to the same destination. But there is that point of divergence. I don't see a lot of references specifically to Messiah in what I've read. Granted, there might be something I haven't read on Philo that would sway my opinion, but it seems that Philo is referring strictly in the deified sense of things, whereas Paul very blatantly is referring to the Messiah, and he even checks that against Peter afterwards.
Well, I mean, don't you think that can be easily explained by the diverse set of Jewish beliefs at the time? Like, them, differing on that one particular portion. To me, it seems like different denominations.
It can be different denominations, but that ultimately ends up in this situation where you have, like, for instance, different Protestants who won't agree on a triune God. Like, they're obviously both following a similar religion. They're both agreeing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. They're both agreeing that Yahweh is God. But that point of divergence is so... I think that it's not just a minute point that creates a second split. That point ends up being a very important point of contention between the two. Like, I think that, much like how when a small matter of, or what seems to be a small matter of opinion, can lead to a different denomination in the church, it seems like with Paul and Philo, that small point is strong enough that it would create two completely different schools of thought. Even if 98% of it is convergent, it's still enough to create completely different schools of thought.
Okay, and you don't, and so you, I guess, do you think? Let me end on this. I guess. Do you think that this particular point works against mythicism, or do you find that it's like a null thing, kind of like the whole archangel bit in general? Do you think, like, it doesn't help mythicism at all?
I don't think it does a lot to help mythicism, but like with the archangel thing, I don't think it helps historicity either. Because if we're let me clarify. Okay, not you clarifying. Stop it. If I can clarify, when you're saying, does this point, the point of Philo and Paul agreeing on most things up until that point of divergence, if that's my point.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that it's the fact that Paul and Philo are, pretty much in agreement until the last that last little bit that where you say they diverge, like.
Mm-hmm. That would seem to me to be a point that really wouldn't work terribly in favor of either, because at that point it's just them both going, okay, these people exist in some form or fashion. They both agree on at least a deified Jesus, or at least a deity in general. They both agree on that. What? I'm trying to argue about a book I don't believe in. Let me do this. But at that point, it's the point of data basically seems to be that two first-century authors didn't agree on a point of theology, but them not agreeing on that point of theology doesn't seem to do much there. It's like if you and I were to argue about the JFK assassination and have differences of opinion on what happened during the grassy knoll, or not during the grassy knoll, but on the grassy knoll. Us having differing opinions on that doesn't affect the state of what happened to JFK. It doesn't do a whole lot in either case. And we might agree, like with Paul and Philo, we might agree on 98% of things up until we get to one point of contention. And it doesn't even, the only difference here is that me and you are in direct communication. We can actually communicate our point of contention with one another. That doesn't seem to be necessarily the thing happening with Paul and Philo. They seem to be just describing similar things and coming to a point where they aren't in agreement. Not necessarily in agreement with each other, not that they're communicating with one another. Their points just seem to be different. So I don't think it really affects historicity or mythicism in either way. It's a good point for discussion, and I agree that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been here for an hour discussing the point and belaboring every little bit. But I don't know if it really does a whole lot for either position. I think it's just an interesting data point to look at from both perspectives. Because if the mythicism position happens to turn out to be the historically accurate one, then there's a lot of stuff that you can do with it. And if the historicity position is the historically accurate one, there's a lot of stuff that can be done with that perspective too. Because I think literally the fact that me and you were able to have a conversation where we agreed on all of the facts that happened, but came out on two different ends, and that conversation shows that it functions decently well for both, at least in our heads. Now, granted, you and I are both just idiots on the internet, me probably more than you. So I don't think that the fact that we can have this conversation doesn't mean a whole lot. But
Well, yeah, I don't know. It depends on who you ask as to whether or not I'm an idiot. But yeah, I mean, I definitely come out with a different conclusion than you, because for me because the minimal mythicist position is that Jesus, or this Messiah figure, originally started out as an archangel. So what would that mean? What would we expect to find? We would expect to find like Jews completely separate of the current mainstream like view of Jesus and the Messiah. These Jews would have used the Old Testament to describe the very same figure that we see Paul describing later. And if, for me, the fact that Philo gives us exactly that, as well as the multitude of different the multitude of different beliefs surrounding Jesus in the first century, it kind of seems to me like it would definitely be in favor of mythicism, because if what we should expect to find, if Jesus or this Messiah figure wasn't like an archangel figure in Jewish theology, then we shouldn't find any like references to the same kind of figure in any of the Jewish writings prior to the 30s AD. If he really didn't start out as that, and he originally started out as a historical figure, then we shouldn't find those things prior to his existence, or at least prior to Paul, because Paul was writing about 20 years after, which him supposedly dying in the 30s, why I say, prior to the 30s. But I mean, that's exactly what we have. Is we have a Jewish writer who is describing the very same type of angel that Paul later on describes as his Messiah. And so for me, it definitely is a point in the mythicist corner. But I guess I can understand your position of it not counting for or against either side.
Yeah, because I hold the position that a Jesus figure starting out as an archangel, and then there being like a post hoc explanation of he was deified afterwards as an explanation of his resurrection. Not only because that sounds like something that would function within theology, but that's literally what I was taught when I was in Christian private school. PCA, they literally like the if I can frame this a way that might seem a little bit facetious and funny, but still it's kind of accurate to how I was taught. The way we were taught the Jesus story in school was that he functioned mostly as a human with the ability to perform some miracles before his death, but then after his death he had essentially reached his final form, if you want to go ahead and just like shove Dragon Ball Z onto here. That's kind of how they framed it when I was in class, at least, is that after his resurrection, there was something different. It wasn't just like if you and I were talking and suddenly I decided that I wanted to test whether or not you were a god, shot you in the head, and then you got back up and I'm like, oh crap, that was a mistake. Not just did I murder a friend of mine, but also he turns out to be a deity. I'm kind of screwed now. But it seems to me that the way we were taught was that there was some functional difference aside from that between Jesus pre-death and post-death. And that seems to coincide with some Christian thinking on Paul viewing Jesus as being somehow more deified after dying in his human manifested form. But if that just ends up being a point of like agree and disagree, then all that means is we get to have another conversation later. And I'm fine with that.
Yeah, we definitely can. Which, I mean, I know that you still have your other history video that you got to get put together, and I'm always doing mythicist stuff, so.
Hey, fair enough. And by the time we run out of topics for my first video, I might have made a second one, and we'll have more shit to disagree on.
Exactly. Well, we've been going about an hour, almost an hour, 15 minutes now. So I think that we're gonna, if you're okay with it, Suris, unless you had anything in particular that you wanted to grill me about, because I know I've kind of been grilling you the entire time.
and I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't really have anything to grill you on specifically, unless you wanted to get into another conversation about the Raglan theorem like we did last time. That's a can of worms, a very, very very bad can of worms to jump into if we wanted to end anytime soon. But if I could make a request, actually, that might work out, the next time we have a discussion on this, if we make the topic on applications of ranked Raglan and seeing how many characters we can plug into it back and forth, that actually might be an interesting discussion. Like plugging in, finding a character and seeing how many of the 22 points they actually fit to see where should this person be considered hero classification, should this person not be considered part of the hero archetype, and then dialing that conversation after plugging in all of that back into the mythicist discussion, since it is one of the points that's used by both Carrier and Robert Price.
Well, yeah, but I mean, at least I'm not sure about how Robert Price uses it, but I mean, like the rank Raglan thing isn't what Carrier's hypothesis rests on.
True, and much like with the Archangel thing, I'm not arguing that anything rests on it. I'm just saying that having the discussion on the single data point could be fun and interesting.
Okay. All right, that sounds pretty awesome. What do you got coming up this week on your channel? Do you have anything that's coming up?
So this week, I actually have 2 videos made already that patrons already patrons already have the ability to see. There was an earlier video on my channel where I tackled Dr. Gene Kim when he tried to make a 3-point argument on why atheists are incredibly stupid. I'm going to explain this the way I want to explain it, and then I'm going to be actually truthful. I want to explain it in saying, I did a video on him about, I did a response to this particular video about 8 months ago, and I wasn't terribly satisfied with it, so I've revisited it, and I think I can argue my point better in this video. Let me be truthful with you, though. The actual reason is that I forgot I responded to it. And then found out after I had produced and edited and published to patrons afterwards that, oh, wait a minute, I've already responded. That's why this video seemed really familiar. Oops.
Dr. Gene Kim thinks that Hitler lives in the Hollow Earth, right?
Gene Kim also thinks that the Bible talks very expressly about marijuana.
Oh, yeah?
He thinks that he takes a point from, I believe it's in Kings, where it says the death is in the pot, when it's referring to a brew that's being made that's supposed to be poison for a monarch. He tries to argue that means that the Bible is saying that marijuana will kill you. It's actually kind of hilarious. The other video that I have coming out this week specifically is I have a response to I gathered 9 comments from my comment section, some of the worst and not the most hateful ones. I didn't grab all the comments that told me to kill myself. I should have, but I didn't. And decided to do a response to each of them. Some of the people in those comments I've responded to in the comment section before, and now I'm just like, okay, let's do a video response to them. But this one is just a video response to those. And then the third video I have coming out is going to be this is the one that is not edited yet, so patrons can't see this one yet. Is We're Nazi Socialists, and going through, it's about a 17-minute video, at least the audio 17 minutes long. Video is going to be probably about 20. Going into, what do we find when we look back in history about what happened when the Nazi Party was being formed in the 1920s up until the point where it evolved into the Third Reich? Do we see any evidence that this party was actually socialist? Again, no, we actually don't, which is awkward, but that's going to be that video for that. So that's going to be fun. That one should premiere at some point this week. I do not know when. Again, that's the one that's not edited yet.
Okay. That all sounds awesome. I just recently put a link to Suris's channel in the stream, and I'm going to be editing the actual stream information later to have a direct link to your channel in there. I do have a link to the original video that we're kind of going over tonight, linked in the description. So you guys want to go watch that and see what Suris has to say on the entire, I guess on a few points of mythicism.
This is what YouTubers do. We recycle our content by talking about it after we've made it.
Hey, I cut up my live streams that I do. I'll cut those up sometimes, and just real quick. Like, it takes me about an hour and a half to get it done. But I'll do it real quick, and I'll put it up, and it'll get the same, if not more, views than when I originally streamed it. So,
hey, you have to play. The only other thing I would say is, if you are in the chat and you have been holding donations and you have not donated to the charity yet, I just plugged it one more time in my Twitch chat. Please go ahead and donate to the charity itself. I announced on my channel yesterday that this debate was going to be specific, not just because me and GE disagree on a thing, so we're talking about it like adults, but also because we were trying to raise more money for the charity, for the charity itself. So if you are waiting to pledge into the charity, the link to the PayPal pool is sitting in there. I know that for my part, I'm going to be donating my portion via PayPal to Clark's Christmas Kids, which is a local organization in my area for giving gifts to foster children and children who are in the system who wouldn't otherwise have a Santa Claus experience, basically. So if you haven't donated into the fundraiser already, do it. And that's my shameless plug for the night.
Definitely, we're almost at our goal. Actually, we're
we have 1,700 to go, and we hit our goal.
Get us to 80%.
yes. Somebody go and get us to 80%. That would be awesome. I still have yet to donate to it myself. I've been waiting for that sweet Google paycheck. So,
Well, and we adopted 2 kids of our own.
well, yeah. So we also adopted 2 kids of our own. The list, not the actual kids. they're
You just
Christmas
brought them into
lists.
your house. Merry Christmas! I got a new gift. Children.
We got 2 kids' Christmas lists, and we're buying them things, and so I'm also going to be donating to the money pool here soon. So, anyways, that's going to be it for us tonight. Definitely go subscribe to Suris. If you're on Suris's Twitch, come subscribe to me if you want to argue with me about historical Jesus stuff.
And also, if you're seeing this video on my channel afterwards, then go to subscribe. Don't just subscribe to GE if you're watching this on Twitch. You can also do that if you're watching this on my channel afterwards.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to go on ahead and head on out of here. We appreciate everybody joining in tonight. And I know my going out thing is stand up and use your voice. I don't know if you have a going out thing.
Oh, yeah. Insert end of video tagline here.
There you go. All right. We'll see everybody later. Y'all have a lovely night, and donate if you can. Bye, heathens.
We promise we're not going to spend the money on cheese.